So again, welcome everybody. And Dr. Barton, could you start by giving a brief introduction? So could you tell us a little bit, what's your background studying the Belt and Road Initiative in particular, and what are you doing? Where are you at the moment?
Thanks, George. Good day to you and good evening from Malaysia. So I'm currently based at the University of Nottingham's Malaysia campus. I've been based here for the past 3 years now. And I've been working on China for the best part of a bit more than a decade now, looking at various aspects of Chinese foreign policy. But since I joined UNM, I've focused my research a bit more around the Belt and Road Initiative, and I guess more so from a political, geopolitical, and a dimension linked to economic statecraft. So trying to understand predominantly how China might use its financing in order to get countries to behave in a way that they wouldn't necessarily otherwise behave. And more specifically, my research of late has focused on investigating Chinese investments via the Maritime Silk Road, which is of course the maritime component of the Belt and Road Initiative, looking in particular at financing in ports, in terms of the ports, particularly in the port of Djibouti, the Doraleh container terminal. That's one aspect I've been looking at in particular. And beyond that, looking at other investments or projects in ports around the ocean, the Indian Ocean region, in Pakistan, in Bangladesh, in Sri Lanka, in parts in Malaysia as well. So really focusing more on how China might be using those particular investments for political purposes or not, or whether that's just something which is being fabricated outside of China in order to undermine the Belt and Road Initiative as well.
Excellent. I think there's a lot of issues there, and oh dear, unfortunately, I'm finding that Dr. He is having some problems attending Zoom. I'm sure she will be continuing to try to join us at the moment. It appears there might be some issues with the connection from China. So Benjamin, you might have a little bit more heavy lifting to do today than previously expected.
That's okay. I'll do my best.
No, I'm sure we'll try to get her back in a little while. So shifting focus, as we've said, your background then is very much again the international relations side of things. This is your focus, and the Maritime Silk Road. So should we begin a little with the Maritime Silk Road? And so what in your research, in your things, what's the background to this, and how has that developed to what it is today? Yeah. And perhaps you could think about addressing your understanding of China's motives towards this initiative and putting all this investment into there. With regard to you hint towards the conceptions that we have about these the political side of things. So if you could talk on that for a moment, that would be great.
Yeah. So I think the Maritime Silk Road, the Belt and Road Initiative, essentially, there's nothing really new to them for those who've been following China or Chinese foreign policy for the best part of well, at least since the turn of the 21st century. The reason being is that the way that we see the map of the Belt and Road Initiative and the Maritime Silk Road, and we look at that, and it seems very expansive. It seems as if it's been very well thought out and planned out. But essentially, it's just, from the way I see it, a very smart marketing move on behalf of the Chinese government to encapsulate ongoing and future projects, future infrastructure projects, under one strategic heading, which is the Belt and Road Initiative. But if we look at the way that, say, Chinese state-owned enterprises and even private companies have been operating in the field of infrastructure since the year 2000 onwards, if we look at, for example, the African continent, Chinese companies have been developing their expertise for the best part of 2 decades now. And so they've been involved in large-scale infrastructure projects, whether it's building condominiums, whether it's transport, whether it's building infrastructure for sporting events. And that's just been done in a way which is hasn't been consolidated under a certain government framework. But with, of course, the advent of Xi Jinping as president of China, it was his initiative to, not only consolidate that under one policy initiative, but also to try and allow Chinese companies to facilitate the ability of Chinese companies to create opportunities outside of China, where perhaps markets were less convoluted, where there was more demand, because sometimes in China, the demand for infrastructure financing was somewhat was not as available, as readily as available, as the need was not as not always there. And so the Maritime Silk Road and the BRI essentially is providing financing for some of these Chinese champions to then create more business opportunities for themselves overseas and allow themselves to consolidate a position of strength on markets overseas for infrastructure projects. And so that's essentially the kind of top-down way in which the government allows these companies to move or to reinforce their international standing and help them create more opportunities outside of China. And the drive, of course, is not so. In part, it's to help alleviate some of the burden which we see of economic growth in China, and allowing state-owned companies to, although they might have had an international dimension, but to further grow their international business so that they become world leaders. If I take the example of China Port Merchants, it was already a very big company in China, but essentially the Belt and Road Initiative allows that company to go even higher up on the global value chain. So that's part of the process and part of the drive behind having both the Belt and Road Initiative and the Maritime Silk Road. Of course, as you said, looking at this from an international relations perspective, there's also a political drive behind it. If you look at the original thinking behind the Silk Road, but more importantly, the Maritime Silk Road, you see that China and Xi Jinping essentially was targeting ASEAN member states, Southeast Asia. That's why the Maritime Silk Road was announced in Jakarta, Indonesia, in 2013, because it was supposed to present to China's neighbors in Southeast Asia this image of a country which was also benevolent and dedicated to, sharing prosperity, a community of shared destiny. That's the translation from Xi Jinping's original speech given to some of its Asian neighbors. And so the Maritime Silk Road is China's attempt also to counterbalance the rather assertive, if not aggressive, demeanor, which is triggered by its actions in the South China Sea. So that's also the external dimension, which complements the internal dimension to support the Chinese economy. So in a nutshell, that's essentially what the BRI and the Maritime Silk Road are targeting.
Great. Thank you very much. There's quite a large question and an involved answer. Let me take this opportunity now to welcome Dr. Shuaishuai. Thank you for joining us. Sorry about the technicalities. So let's come back to the beginning. Dr. He, would you mind introducing yourself to our guests, and if you have a little bit of focus on what is your area of your special area with the infrastructure development, and this is your background, and then after that there is a question from Matthew Bennett we'll try and get to.
Great, thank you. Well, hello everyone. Sorry I was a couple of minutes late. Technical issues, old people. Well, it's very nice to be meeting everyone. Well, my name is Shuaishuai He. So I'm an urban planner by training. So I started from planning and building infrastructures, but then I moved on to my graduate schools, and then I started to look into railway lines and then canals as such, transportation infrastructures, and then further on to study the kind of strategy and broader scales of planning of these types of infrastructure. So I I did quite some field work in China, in the UK, in Europe, and also South America on this topic. So in recent years, especially since 2016, when I returned to China, I started working in this new development area in Chongqing, which is in southwest China, where this was the first railway line, express railway line between China and Europe. So that's a major part of this BRI we've been talking about. So that's a brief introduction to my experience. And then, so I'm aware that today is a panel discussion, so I will not talk too much about myself, and then I will encourage more discussions.
Excellent, thank you. So I'm not sure, were you, I'm interested in how much you were able to hear of Dr. Barton's introduction of his understanding of the background of Belt and Road with sort of maritime development. And from your perspective, from the Chinese point of view, well, what do you take? Is that is there any difference in your understanding from the external understanding?
Well, from the last bit I heard, well, what Dr. Barton was talking about, I gather that the question was the background of the initiative, why it was kind of proposed and promoted to the rest of the world, and also the kind of mechanism behind it, how it was supposed to be organized, that type of thing. Okay, if I understand correctly, then sure. Well, I will try not to make it sound like propaganda, and then to be like too much advertising on this. Well, my personal understanding was that so China is it's a developing country. That's a widely accepted notion, I'm sure. Well, and then so because of the whole ideology of our political system, and then we believe in the common good of human being, mankind. So we did take some decades of struggles of finding our path and the ways to develop, and then a lot of things. But then in recent years, I think because of a lot of work done to the poverty issues and the related issues, and many of that, we have come to this new time that we believe that South-South cooperation is the key to help all the developing countries to move forward. Personally and professionally, I think that's the major background of this initiative. And then that's why China proposed this and has been promoting this. And then also we've seen in recent years, especially because of all the global issues like human rights and then climate change, and then more of those inequality happening in the world. So I think it's not because we're a developing country that means we should be focusing on getting ourselves out of poverty. That's not the only issue. In order to have longer standing and more sustainable development, we should all join hands and then do this in a more global scope. That's also why we've kind of well, and also I forgot to mention that my background, there was also part of heritage conservation. So I think from that point of view, I think China was doing a bit of heritage conservation by bringing up this whole theme of Silk Road and maritime Silk Road, and then eventually we reached the BRI. So I think there's a lot of cultural and international development and a lot of international affairs issues involved in this.
Great, thank you. And it's good we both we've now almost caught up a little bit. So I'd like so Benjamin, we have a question here that I think comes directly from Matthew Bennett. Thank you for that. And just a reminder that please, anyone who's watching, please feel free to add your questions into the chat, and we will try to make sure that they are answered. So that Benjamin asks, Matthew asks, does the Maritime Belt and Road also support China's Blue Water Navy strategy? I'm not sure.
Yeah, that's a question which I think many people are asking themselves, and it's difficult to answer right now. Although the BRI and the Maritime Silk Road are now entering officially their 7th year, there has been a lot of discussion about, is there a link between the type of infrastructure projects which make up this Maritime Silk Road and any military or strategic ambition on behalf of the People's Liberation Army and of course the Chinese government. I mean, from the research I've carried out so far, I was able to kind of comprise a certain typology of ports, of these BRI ports. If we're looking at this purely from a kind of security perspective. And so for all the ongoing projects, and there's, if I'm not mistaken, now 11 such projects of different types. Some are building brand new ports, some are regeneration projects, others are just are dredging projects. I mean, they don't really have a kind of security component to them. But if we look at the big picture, what we see is that if say, and I hope this never happens, but say war broke out tomorrow, and the Chinese Navy needed to leverage some of these ports for strategic or security purposes, ultimately the only port they could rely upon right now is the port of Gwadar, which is in Pakistan, because it has a garrison which is there actually not for offensive purposes, but for defensive purposes, mostly to help protect Chinese engineers and workers who are involved in projects which are in quite highly volatile areas in Pakistan, building the China-Pakistan Economic Corridor. It goes through some regions of Pakistan like Balochistan, which are unsafe. These engineers, although they're there just to do their job, they have been targeted, and have been basically told that they're not necessarily welcome by groups who harbor certain subversive aims. If we look at the other projects, well, to be honest, it's quite difficult to find a security component to them, meaning that if war was to break out, then the People's Liberation Army could certainly not rely upon them in any way to use them as a base, whether for logistic purposes or for offensive or defensive purposes at sea. So although there has been rumors that some of these port projects would involve a clause whereby the People's Liberation Army Navy would have, for example, a quay built for them as part of, let's say, the project in Hambantota, the famous Hambantota port project, which is, I think the one which most people refer to when they talk about the geopolitical dimensions of the Belt and Road Initiative. That's actually never been confirmed for now. So it's, again, the empirical evidence doesn't really support that per se. So the question which is asked here is about the Blue Water Navy strategy. I think that's a question which is more pertinent for the time being for the South China Sea issue. But as for the rest of the Belt and Road Initiative and the Maritime Silk Road, it's not really been the case. And let's presume that, say, the Chinese government, Beijing tends to be quite sensitive to this. Let's say they're really adamant and they want to include the People's Liberation Army Navy in a Belt and Road Initiative deal. My feeling is that would cause so much controversy in the country which would agree to it, let's say Tanzania, Kenya, Sri Lanka, that probably they'd have to cancel that part of the deal as well. And that's been something that's a recurring theme we see now on BRI projects, is that in democratic countries, there has been some pushback, particularly when there's elections, and that sometimes has hurt these BRI projects too.
Right. Well, thank you. Yeah, Dr. Hurt, please, I'm sure you have thoughts.
Please. Yeah, I'll definitely respond to that. Well, I think this question is more about the tactic issues, but I think BRI is more a strategic thing. So I think part of it, how to tackle it, it's more like, so if we are a isolated nation, like say North Korea, and then if we decided to do something irrational, and then I guess there's not a lot we have to lose, that type of thing. But then this BRI has always been this initiative that's all about and cooperation. So like Dr. Barton has just mentioned, that if for some reason there's war to break out, then a lot of those countries that have agreed to be a part of this initiative would probably drop out. And then also this is from the other angle, is more likely a lot of, well, certain country might have the goals of attacking China at some point, but then because of the friendship between China and many other countries involved in this initiative, then attacking China wouldn't be a very easy thing to do or very rational thing to do. So, like I said, I think this is a strategic thing to think about instead of a tactic thing. Well, I wouldn't comment too much on this because this is, I thought we were supposed to talk about trade and
I think this is very worthwhile because underpinning, of course, when we look towards trade, there has to be some measure of trust and some measure of openness that needs to be aware. And if there are certainly views around the world about Belt and Road Initiative, and it is always worthwhile to address those to see how that might, obviously, when we look at Western approaches and ideas towards Belt and Road, to have a clear foundation of trade, there needs to be this trust and to build that relationship. And I think that's something worth, again, looking at. And I want to bring that back to Dr. something that you did mention about the heritage conservation. And again, there's something we have had a small discussion on before, and I think this is perhaps another area that people are not quite aware of. And Benjamin, please feel free to share your views on this in Southeast Asia and what you've seen. There is the idea that perhaps this infrastructure development is trying to taking over, or sort of very much influencing and expanding. So when you've described the heritage conservation and the efforts they're doing there to try to sort of come against this and see that this is useful, would you talk about that and how you've seen that the Belt and Road is trying to sort of balance these views and trying to make sure that their partners are supported properly?
mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a great topic to talk about. I welcome all discussions from anyone who's attending today. Well, yeah, heritage conservation. I think that's really something that mankind is sharing, especially at this time while there's a pandemic and a lot of cultural differences have been put aside, and then we're all joining forces to develop vaccines and then medicines and then emergency response, that type of actions. So heritage conservation is part of that too. Actually, so BRI has been has been around for a few years, and then a lot of the infrastructure development in Africa and in Southeast Asia, they have all been under this framework. So we have, of course, gathered the feedback that a lot of people in these regions, they complain about the fast development of infrastructure, and then some people even talk about this is the new type of occupying other countries' land and space. That's why in recent years we have done the several projects I could talk about actually now. One of them was this one we've been doing in Myanmar. So we have been helping them to do heritage conservation for some of the historic sites and cities in the country. And then also, I think we all know that we have been also building a lot of transportation infrastructures between these two countries, and energy infrastructures like energy and pipeline, that type of development projects. But then in the same time, we're now more focusing on developing this more intangible infrastructure first before going in there and then building something that maybe the rest of the world deem that's effective and necessary, but then maybe not by the local people. So heritage conservation has definitely been a major part in BRI now. And then we're also developing this new type of collaboration and partnerships in Laos and then in Vietnam, because we're now, well, we're actually finishing the railway line between Laos and China next year. So definitely we're hoping, especially because Vietnam, they have also got some newly listed World Heritage sites in recent years. But then part of the successful listing was because they're really in a very original state, meaning the local people have been suffering from basically non-developing at all years for a very long time. That's why their heritage sites have been in such a authentic state. But then the local people, they would like to benefit from whatever that could be brought to a World Heritage site, which in many countries we have seen the blooming tourism, and then also a lot of cultural exchanges and knowledge exchanges. So now we're also looking into helping Vietnamese friends to safely protect their heritage sites, their heritage, and then also help the local people to benefit from this newly listed World Heritage site.
Okay. I'm gonna jump in there. Thank you. I think it's good to know that, again, that certainly from the side, China side, this is and things. So Dr. Barton, is this something that you've seen in the new development, as you mentioned, this maritime development? Is this something that's been, there are any examples that you've seen of this and how this is being put into practice in the maritime area?
In the maritime, from my own research, not so much, but that's mainly also because I'm not really looking at that from that angle. From what I can see, from what you mentioned before, Dr. He's intervention about Southeast Asia, which I guess fits in nicely to the example of Myanmar. Thus far, I think the aim is if we focus more on the region, this part of the world, so Thailand, Malaysia, Indonesia, this part of Southeast Asia, I think the projects thus far have been quite standard. Transport projects here in Malaysia, there's the East Coast Railway line, which is starting up as we speak, connecting the East Coast to the West Coast of the Western Peninsula of Malaysia. In Indonesia, you have also railway projects undergoing, and in Bangkok, you got the Bangkok Mass Railway transport system, which is being built up in collaboration with non-Chinese companies as well. And so it seems to me that that dimension of heritage is not one which has been given particular focus. Now, I think this brings into another aspect of the Belt and Road Initiative, which is not often talked about, and that is the role that local decision makers play in deciding what kind of projects are put forward. Because the image often projected is that it's China, that there's people in an office somewhere in China who decide all these projects and provide the financing, but it's a much more fluid and dynamic process than that, and it often involves, the networks built up between, on the one hand, Chinese construction companies, Chinese policy banks, and then local politicians or entrepreneurs, and it's this is a really fluid process. So if we go, for example, come back to the issue of the port of Hambantota, which is quite famous for the because it's often given as the example of this debt trap which China is laying. Actually, the initiative came from the from Mahinda Rajapaksa, who was the former prime minister of Sri Lanka, and is actually his district in Sri Lanka is Hambantota. So he wanted to show the people, you know, this is what I can do for you. But of course, he can't do that by just depending on himself or Sri Lankan companies. He needs expertise, he needs financing, and he needs to know that the companies are going to be able to produce. And that's what, you know, Chinese construction companies have built up this reputation that they can get things done. So that's why it's appealing. Now, coming back to, for example, Malaysia, this is where there's a kind of political dimension to it as well, because I think on the whole, Malaysians who know about the Belt and Road Initiative and know about the projects, on the whole, I think they support them because they know that Southeast Asia has one problem, which is a lack of investment in infrastructure. In fact, the whole world suffers from this problem. And the BRI only helps to meet 1% of that. So it is in fact a global public good in itself. So I think that on the whole, there's support for that, but it's more the role that local politicians play in determining the BRI outcome. Now, what I mean by that is, in Malaysia, we had elections in 2018, sorry, and for the first time in 60 years, there was a change of government because it's always the same ruling party which had been re-elected. And the former prime minister at the time, Prime Minister Najib, he had relied a lot upon the Belt and Road Initiative. He'd signed up to a number of projects because he was pushing an agenda for modernization. Now, I think that agenda for modernization, that is supported, that will get you the political votes. But the problem is that he was a bit reckless in terms of not sustainably negotiating the deals, or just simply signing up to projects without really thinking about the long-term macroeconomic impacts that they can have. So I think that there's this, that's where, you know, people think that this BRI is something which does not concern them or is only dictated by what happens in China. Actually, they're wrong, because it's for the countries who become signatories and who have signed up to projects, you know, they're very much a part of this decision-making process. And that's, I think, a really key element to the success of the BRI in the long term is to make sure that that decision makers are fully aware of the strengths and the weaknesses which are inherent to the BRI. But the BRI definitely helps to meet a need in the region and globally for infrastructure, because Dr. He said in some parts of the world, there's no infrastructure or there's lacking infrastructure. And then the other problem is that countries like Myanmar, they don't necessarily have many options in terms of financing. You know, where do they turn? They can ask international multilateral banks like the IMF or the World Bank, but they're not really interested in infrastructure financing anymore. That's something which they've kind of gradually stopped paying attention to. They can look at private commercial banks, but then often the interest rates are very high, or the banks themselves don't want to get involved in these kind of projects because they're not financially viable in the short term. Because anyway, large-scale infrastructure projects aren't necessarily the most money-making endeavors, but they have other dimensions to them as well. And so, you know, then suddenly there's the Chinese government and its initiative and its desire to create business opportunities, which kind of, you know, it's almost like the best package out there for sure, because they've got the financing, they've got the know-how and expertise, and they've got the people who are willing to help build these projects. So that's also, I think, an interesting dimension to the BRI. It's this local agency which is not often talked about.
Thank you very much for that, Benjamin. And I'd like to, in a moment, shift towards how this infrastructure development can have an impact on the UK, potentially at the moment in the future, and the opportunities there. But we have just had a question from Jessica Ann. Thank you very much. And if yourself or Dr. He would like to mention, the question is whether there has been any negative impact on local environment, which is now a hot topic, looking at infrastructure, construction, business, and whether there's action that's been taken to preserve ecosystems based around these infrastructure. If you have any knowledge about this area, please, either of you, feel free to share.
I don't know, does Dr. He want to go first? Please take the floor.
Okay, thank you. Okay, I'll try to answer this question. Yes, definitely. I think it's not particularly about BRI projects. It's just the large scale infrastructure projects. Usually, they would have environmental impact. So this is not necessarily about BRI, but then definitely I would say, as a matter of fact, um, there has been issues on local environment. The environment being the physical environment, being the ecosystem, and also being the kind of local social environment. Like like what I just mentioned. For instance, if you build a railway line, obviously you will have to use the land that used to be, for instance, agriculture or settlements, and then a lot of people would have to move, and then would have to work a different line of work, and then all sorts of things. So definitely I would say that's part of large scale infrastructure projects. That's why I want to answer this question by bridging this with what George would want to talk about next, um, about this infrastructure, the construction, and also between UK and China. So at the moment, there's several directions we're taking to try to tackle this exact question you just asked, because this is very important. And then we all know that China has made big promises and commitment towards the UN SDGs and also the Paris Agreement. So as an active member of the BRI, we're definitely implementing all those actions and principles in this too. So to give you a more specific example is that we're actually well, one example that's from my own work is with my alma mater, Oxford University. We have actually been working closely with the Said Business School. That's a group of academics and practitioners. They have done decades of research into major project management. So some of their examples are those big dams that's developed in Africa and in Asia, and also they have done research into, say, bridges that's bringing together continents. So those type of large scale infrastructure construction projects and what those have done to the local environment, being the environment, being the social environment, being the local economy. So now we have been in this process of utilizing all their research results and developing this database. And then eventually we're going to develop this new product that's going to be an interactive platform. So say if you have a new BRI infrastructure project, and then you put this project into our platform, and then it will extract all those elements that's matching the previous projects being successful or failures, and then we can prevent whatever bad that happened in the past, and then we will carry on with whatever that worked in the past. So this is a very specific example of us trying to tackle this problem, which is, as you said, that's the local environment with the BRI. So that's definitely part of it, and also it's a very tight collaboration between UK and China. And also the China side would be academics, practitioners, and also the government side. Well, most of the decision making process involved people would be a part of this.
Okay, thank you. Dr. Barton, do you have any comments on this question?
Yeah, well, of course, being large infrastructure projects, they require impact assessments, which, of course, there's environmental impact assessments. Whether the findings of those environmental impact assessments are always respected to the letter, I wouldn't know, because it's not my area. But there have been, at least in Malaysia, there was some controversy over some of the residential projects of the BRI in terms of whether they were respecting to the letter the environmental impact assessment. But that's, I guess also a matter of how local authorities deal with BRI projects, because they have a role to play in that regard as well. Of course, one other dimension which I think is interesting for our discussion here would be financing. Now, financing for the BRI, of course, for the most part, comes from from China, or comes from the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank. But there's also things like green bonds or BRI green bonds, which have been used with the City of London in a way to raise capital for BRI projects, which of course will have an ecological dimension to them. So I think that's where definitely one area where the UK and I think can use its added value and the added value of the City of London to play a role in determining the kind of projects which, especially since now I'm reading recently that the Chinese government, of course, has to be quite wary of the kind of the largesse which goes into BRI projects, given that there has been some disgruntlement in China about how much money the government is spending outside of China at a time when, although the Chinese economy is certainly doing much better than the rest of the world, it's still 1% GDP growth for China is not necessarily good news, whether for China or outside of China. So I think that there's that element as well. Now, one thing I just wanted to mention is that with Nottingham, we've got 3 campuses. There's the Nottingham campus in the UK, there's the Malaysia campus here, and there's also the campus in Ningbo, south of Shanghai. And we've been toying with the idea of collaborative kind of tri-campus initiative, where colleagues in particularly the environmental sciences schools across the 3 campuses would propose research into how BRI projects could also complement protection of wildlife. And that particularly in countries like Southeast Asian countries, in Malaysia, in Thailand, where you've got, let's say, elephant population, and then you want to build some form of infrastructure which might cut across the habitat of some of this wildlife. So how can you go about thinking of projects which will then also consider nature to be a real factor, not just an exogenous or collateral factor, but an endemic factor in these projects as well. And I'm not sure whether that's something which will one day reflect the Belt and Road Initiative, but since it's not going anywhere anytime soon, there is that prospect that the BRI might be innovative. It might bring innovation in terms of the protection of the environment as well. And that's something which I think all countries should encourage, not just the Chinese government, which has its own targets, but the international community. If this is something which is going to stay, then it's something which I think should be brought onto the table for discussion. How can we collaborate to make this something whereby nature isn't necessarily going to suffer as a result? Because indeed we are talking about kind of classic but much needed infrastructure projects.
Great. Thank you very much. And thank you again, Jessica, for that question. And with about 15 minutes left, I'd say now is the time to get any other questions you would like addressed into the chat. So as I mentioned, as we've said, we've achieved from both of you, the large focus of Belt and Road is currently on south-to-south development. It's a lot of focus on Southeast Asia, and this is still developing, still growing. In my discussions previously with both of you, there are UK industries currently involved in aspects of Belt and Road. So there are opportunities for groups, financials, you've mentioned, Dr. Ho, you've mentioned architecture firms, for example, consultancy. There is UK involvement in projects that are outside of the UK. So would you, Dr. Ho, perhaps you could speak first on this one. How can the UK become involved, and what do you think is the potential based on the BRI for UK to get involved, for businesses within the UK to benefit ultimately from this?
Oh, great. Yeah, that's very important, because I still consider myself an urban planner, and then I'm very practical. So although I have been an academic, but then I've always tried to make my research useful. So I would hope that today's discussion, and then all the discussions surrounding about BRI would come to a conclusion or some kind of solution to a problem, and then to do something good. So definitely this is something we need to talk about, and then I do have some knowledge on this. And also I would like to mention something kind of referring to what Dr. Barton just mentioned. There actually last time with George, we talked about the collaboration between China and the UK on BRI, and then we talked about there could be rule setting, the international standards making, and financing and innovation. That would be the three, I think, main sectors, fields we could work together with. And then also last time I forgot to mention that there's actually being this guidelines that's already brought forward by China and the UK. It's a sort of code of practice between us, but then we're hoping to push that forward towards all BRI countries and regions. So this main guidelines is about construction, how to make construction greener. And then this is all about making green investment and then green financing. So this is a whole code of practice to encourage whoever involved in a BRI project to raise their environmental consciousness, to improve climate resilience, and also to improve social inclusiveness. Well, based on that, I think between the UK and China, we have already been working together closely in, for instance, what I just mentioned, research, and then consulting businesses, and then also in creative industry. I think my work, design and then planning, that's part of creative industry. But then that's definitely part of what UK has been historically very good at, creative industry. There's a lot of famous architects. There's very strong construction companies, and then there's also a lot of design firms, and then they have already been actively involved in a lot of BRI projects already. And then this other part, I think the UK could definitely, UK business could benefit a lot from, would be the area of due diligence, insurance, legal services, education, and training. Because of what we have just talked about, there's a lot of experiences that the UK side could share with the rest of the BRI partners. So by training and education, we could really realize knowledge sharing and capacity building. So I think that's definitely something the two nations could really work together on. And then also, I think I would like to also mention something that maybe in some countries it's not obvious yet, because the kind of physical construction is more visible. But then as far as what I know, that a lot of countries involved in BRI projects, they have been developing a lot of digital cyber smart tech type of BRI infrastructure projects as well. And then going back to this green financing thing, I think because, well, we all know London is probably the biggest financial center in the world. And then also London and Shanghai, they have launched this London-Shanghai Stock Connect already. So that's linking the international financial center with one of the largest capital market in the world already. So that means all the investors from not just UK and the rest of the world, they can gain access to Chinese capital market and companies, and then vice versa. So that's something we could definitely work together on, this green financing. Like what Dr. Benton just said, that if this habitat is going to be cut through, and if the financing side has definitely has a definite say in this, and then that's just a very basic way of controlling direction a project is heading by the financing side. But I'm sure there's a lot of experts. I'm not sure who's really listening in too. So I'm not intending on being an expert in front of the real experts. So I'm not going to go into the financial world too much on this.
All right, so thank you. Ben, there is a quick question. Sorry, Shanlu, I'm going to get to your question. I think that's quite a tricky one for now. But there's the new question about any Sino-UK research funding support program for One Belt One Road trade transactions. So and that's for Benjamin or Shuaishuai. Is this something that anything you've heard about for this? Any research funding support program for One Belt One Road trade transactions? And to clarify, One Belt One Road is now Belt and Road Initiative. Just I believe that's right. Ben, Shuaishuai, do you have any awareness of research funding available through BRI?
I definitely know there's a lot of research funding and education funding between BRI countries that's within Asia. So I'm aware of this upcoming one that's gonna be between China and for instance, Laos and Myanmar and Vietnam, this type of country, not exactly between China and UK that I'm aware of.
Yeah, I think I had heard of one, but the details escape me now. Whether it was the Chinese embassy in London and the British Council, I believe, they had some kind of project connected where they were providing financing for research on the BRI, but whether that was from an education perspective or social science at large, I'm not quite sure. But maybe I could just because Dr. He gave a really very complimentary answer to your question about the role of the UK and China in the BRI. I mean, there's really not much I can add because I think you covered all the bases there. But I guess from a political perspective, I would just say that the UK is also one of the world's largest providers of official development aid, even though the current government is very much intent, I guess, on slicing back whatever it can from that particular part of the budget. But I think the West as a whole, or let's say the Paris Club of Lenders, for a long time have been providing financing to the developing world, of course, with the expectation that certain conditions be met. But the BRI brings up a more fundamental question of what is development? What are the needs of development in the short term, in the medium term, in the long term? And there's definitely a need that, if China's going to continue down this road, and I believe that that's going to be the case, then I think there's a need for some form of complementarity, because if China's out there doing one thing and the Western development providers are doing something completely different, and there's no interaction, there's no complementarity, then it's simply a waste of resources. So I'd say that from a government perspective, and I'm sure the British government is very much aware of this, there's a need to try and streamline how development aid is provided and spent, and how the BRI is helping to meet some development goals as well. And as for, again, this would be more targeted at the British government, and I'm unashamedly promoting a policy paper that I wrote in 2019, which was actually on what the British government should do with regards to the BRI, particularly with with Brexit and leaving the European Union. And one idea was simply that the British government does have itself a large network of connections around the developing world, and it also has an ability through its different government agencies to do capacity building. That's something which Dr. He pointed to. I think that's fundamental, that to the point I was making earlier, that local decision makers, civil society groups in BRI countries, or countries where there are BRI projects, essentially need to know, what can they get from the BRI, how can they make this work for the largest number of people involved, so that it doesn't always become something which is sensationalized, and then seen as a white elephant, which serves very little purpose other than for the company which built it, or for the politician which requested it. So I think that there's definitely a need for interaction there too, on how, the UK can, and I think the issue of standards is another one where definitely the UK has a role to play. And the last point I would make is, the UK is not officially yet a signatory of the Belt and Road Initiative. I'm guessing that given the current political climate, that's not going to happen in the short term, because it seems that the government is now changing its tack on dealings with China. But, I guess what the UK government needs to consider at some point is, what about, infrastructure in the UK? And I know that, of course, there are big infrastructure projects, Hinkley Point and others. But, there are many ports in the UK which could definitely do with some form of investment. And that's not just because the infrastructure is creaking, it's also because those ports are, socially, they're places which have suffered from austerity measures, from globalization, from outsourcing, and they need maybe more than just a lick of paint. And I would say that it's become very political to talk about Chinese investment in the West. And there's all these investment screening mechanisms now in place for mergers and acquisitions made by Chinese companies. And of course, you need to have a legal framework which makes sense for everyone. But ultimately, just shutting the door to Chinese investment might not necessarily be the right answer as well. So perhaps the government and local authorities need to also consider what role BRI financing could play for the UK.
Well, thank you. We are unfortunately coming very much to the end of our time. We have had a couple of other questions. Thank you, Margaret, for asking about the existing international trade standards. Does a Belt and Road fit into any existing international trading standards? There was also a question about, from Shanlu, about investors in a recent book by Peter Hessler, that Chinese investors who invested in Egypt got no support on arrival. I think that's a larger question. I'm afraid I don't think unless you have a very quick response, I think that's perhaps not something that we have time to talk about. But if you have, is there a quick response to the question about international trading standards? Is there any adherence to international trading standards so far?
Oh, I was going to go on the question about Egypt.
Oh, please go, whichever one you say.
Just quickly, I mean, of course, it's, the BRI is not bulletproof in the sense that there are going to be projects which are not going to work, which are going to be failures. And this predates the BRI as well. So I'm not surprised to hear that in some parts of the world, then, sometimes things don't necessarily go according to plan. That's just part and parcel of the BRI. But I mean, what's interesting is that there's not one country in the world which is not concerned now by infrastructure projects coming from China. So I'm sure that even if this particular project didn't work, there will be others soon along the way which may flourish.
Okay, so Dr. He, do you have a comment on the international trading standards, perhaps?
Yeah, sure. I'll give a very quick one. So I can give there's also definitely the copyright one, and then also I'm not sure if Ms. Liu has any knowledge of the pilot-free trade zones in China, and then so the pilot-free trade zones are basically tryout areas where China is experimenting, further opening up. So we're experimenting. We're kind of playing with a lot of notions that's already quite widely accepted in a lot of other countries. For instance, in where there's the Canada, US, and the Mexican, their free trade zones, and then we're experimenting a lot of ideas like that, and then we're hoping that if some of them work well, we can kind of introduce that to the rest of the country, and then towards the whole BRI corridor or pathways or something like that. So that's the kind of work we're doing in regarding international trade standards. And also, we are at the moment developing more kind of code of practice in the areas of copyright. Because we're definitely doing more and more collaborations in creative industry and a lot of education and research. So and also in innovation. So copyright is definitely a huge thing in this that needs to be protected and also needs to be fit into the existing international trade standards. So these are just some simple results I can give you now.
Sorry, let me unmute myself. So thank you both very much. It is now 1 o'clock. I'm sure that we're going to have, there are many other questions, and hopefully we'll be able to get you to do another session like this sometime in the not too distant future. So again, Dr. Barton, Dr. He, thank you both very much for joining us. The recording of this will be available over the next few days. Please check our the Twitter and on the social media of the Confucius Institute. It's at Confucius Cov Uni for Twitter, for Instagram, and at Facebook. And if you have any questions about anything that's happened today, please contact the Confucius Institute at coventry.ac.uk. Those links are in the chat. I'm sure also, Dr. He, Dr. Barton, where can people find you?
I will type in the chat box my email address and my Twitter, if that's okay.
Oh, please, if any of you are willing to. I'm sure people have many other questions, might have questions and wish to get in touch further. Dr. Barton, do you have any social media to plug?
I'm not really that much on social media, but I do have a LinkedIn account if that's useful. So
oh yeah, me too.
I guess I can share that with.
I think anyone can search Benjamin Barton or Shuaishuai on LinkedIn. And again, thank you both very much for your time.
Oh, you're more than welcome. Thanks for the invitation and for the great discussion.
Thank you. Thank you for all the questions too.